Before anyone said a word, the room in Algiers fell into a silence so heavy you could feel it. Delegates stood shoulder to shoulder, men and women who carried the memories of entire nations, while behind them, the soft echo of old brass doors closing sounded almost like the final page of a long, painful chapter. No news alert flashed across American television screens. No headline interrupted evening programming. Yet in that quiet room, something historic unfolded, something the world has avoided hearing for more than a century. For the first time, African nations gathered not to negotiate aid, not to request partnership, and not to offer symbolic speeches. They gathered to name what the world has tried to soften, to blur, to hide behind footnotes. And diplomacy, colonialism, was not a misunderstanding, it was a crime. And like every crime, it leaves a trail of victims, a ledger of losses, and a bill that history has delayed for far too long. As the microphones switched on, leaders spoke with a clarity that cut through the room. Africa is not asking for favors, apologies, or sentiments. Africa is demanding accountability. Land stolen, labor exploited, minerals extracted, cultures erased, entire economies built on the backs of those who never received recognition, let alone compensation. For over 100 years, the world has lived with the benefits of that system, while Africa has lived with its consequences. But why now? Why this moment? What changed that allowed Africa to speak not with outrage but with leverage, strategy, and unity? And perhaps the most important question of all, does the world finally have to listen? My friends, in today's video, we are breaking down what truly happened in Algiers, why this declaration matters, and what it could mean for the future of justice on the continent and far beyond it. If you believe truth should never depend on who controls the microphone, then stay with us, share this message, and join this conversation. Something new has begun. When the conference in Algeria finally began, it did not start with fiery speeches or political theatrics. It began with an unmistakable sense of purpose, a clarity that had been missing from Africa's diplomatic stage for generations. Delegates had traveled from across the continent, seasoned diplomats, legal scholars carrying stacks of documents, historians with decades of research behind them, and representatives from the African Union whose mandate had suddenly shifted from symbolic remembrance to concrete legal action. Every figure in that hall understood that this was not simply another summit. This was Africa attempting to reshape its place in the world. What made the gathering profound was not only its ambition, but its unity. For the first time, nations with different languages, borders, and colonial histories were speaking the same political language. At the center of the discussion was a single, uncompromising declaration: colonialism must be recognized under international law as a crime against humanity. This is the sentence the global system has avoided for 100 years, and yet in Algeria, it was spoken without hesitation. Algeria's foreign minister, Ahmed Attaf, delivered the opening remarks that set the tone for the entire conference. His voice was steady, neither bitter nor apologetic, simply factual, as though he were reading out the balance sheet of history. Africa is not asking for a gesture of goodwill, he said. What Africa is demanding is a rightful claim. His words carried the weight of a continent that has spent decades watching others redefine their past, while Africa's own trauma was minimized, sanitized, or treated as an academic debate. The African Union's earlier resolution stating plainly that colonialism constitutes a crime had already signaled a shift. But this conference was different. This was no longer about recognition. This was about execution, turning moral outrage into legal frameworks, political motions, and binding demands. The agenda was precise, structured, and unapologetically ambitious. First, African nations aimed to create a unified legal definition of colonialism as a crime against humanity, one that could be used in international courts and diplomatic negotiations. This mattered because without a legal definition, colonial abuses exist in a moral vacuum, acknowledged but unenforceable. Second, the conference moved toward concrete reparations, not symbolic payments, not vague promises, but documented claims for economic restitution. Decades of extracted minerals, land that was seized and repurposed, labor exploited to build foreign economies, entire regions underdeveloped by design. These were not abstract grievances, they were measurable losses. Third, the return of cultural heritage was elevated from a cultural issue to a matter of justice. African artifacts, bronzes, sculptures, manuscripts, royal thrones taken under violence or coercion became central to the conversation. These objects are not decorations, one delegate said. They are memory itself. The demand was simple: they must come home. Fourth, the conference outlined the creation of a continental mechanism capable of negotiating, documenting, and legally pursuing claims with former colonial powers. Africa, for the first time, was preparing itself not only emotionally and morally, but structurally and legally. A powerful moment came when Ghana's representative addressed the assembly. With deliberate calm, she proclaimed, "The slave trade must be recognized as the greatest crime against humanity." Her statement connected Africa's past not only to itself, but to the diaspora, to descendants of enslaved Africans in the United States, the Caribbean, Latin America, and Europe. She grounded the demand in numbers: more than 12 million Africans taken across the Atlantic, millions who never returned, and millions more who lived and died under systems built on their unfree labor. Reparations, she said, are not a request, they are overdue justice. By the time the first day ended, one thing had become undeniable. This was not merely a historical reflection. This was Africa preparing to file a case, not metaphorically, but literally, against a world order that had long considered its wounds inconvenient. The Algeria conference did more than announce a new chapter. It framed the past as evidence, the present as leverage, and the future as a negotiation in which Africa would no longer whisper. The turning point of the Algeria conference came not from a single declaration, but from the collective realization that Africa was stepping into a battle the world had never wanted to fight. The air in the hall thickened when one delegate after another began addressing the implications, legal, economic, and moral, of proclaiming colonialism a crime. It was no longer a matter of whether Africa had suffered. That much was indisputable. The question now was, what happens when a continent finally decides to hold the world accountable? That question set the room ablaze. The conversation reached its emotional high when speakers confronted the uncomfortable truth: the world has always tried to sidestep. The effects of colonialism are not historical, they are alive, visible, and measurable today. Roads, borders, currencies, languages, trade policies, and resource flows across Africa still carry the fingerprints of the colonial era. Poverty rates, instability, and economic dependence did not appear spontaneously. They were engineered through extraction and exploitation. For the first time, leaders were not merely naming these realities, they were preparing to litigate them. It was during this moment of clarity that Ghana's representative delivered the speech many later called the moral apex of the summit. Calling the transatlantic slave trade the greatest crime against humanity, she reminded the world that more than 12.5 million Africans were taken across the ocean to build the wealth of nations that still command global influence today. Her voice did not tremble, but it carried the grief of centuries. The room fell still as she asked, if genocide, apartheid, and slavery are recognized as crimes today, how is it that the system that enabled all of them, colonialism, escaped judgment? That question echoed far beyond Algeria. And so did the reactions. The first wave of response came from international observers, scholars, journalists, and diplomats who understood the magnitude of what Africa was attempting. Many quietly admitted that if colonialism were officially categorized as a crime against humanity, it would destabilize the very foundation upon which modern European and American power structures were built. For decades, former colonial powers have offered apologies without liability, museums without restitution, and acknowledgments without consequences. Africa was now challenging that comfortable arrangement. The second reaction was far more political. While no Western nation issued a formal statement during the conference, whispers began circulating among diplomatic circles. European officials privately expressed concern, surprise, and in some cases alarm at Africa's new strategy. Not because they disagreed with the moral argument, many of them no longer deny the atrocities, but because of what the legal argument could unleash. If colonialism becomes a crime under international law, then billions, possibly trillions of dollars in economic claims could be argued in court. Nations like France, Britain, Belgium, Portugal, Germany, and Spain understood the danger immediately. The fear was not abstract. Germany apologized to Namibia for genocide, yet still avoided full reparations. France admitted to systemic abuses in Algeria but refused restitution. Belgium returned a handful of artifacts to Congo but sidestepped responsibility for the millions who died under King Leopold's rule. Africa was now calling out this pattern of selective remorse. The third and perhaps most profound reaction came from within Africa itself. For generations, African nations were divided along linguistic and political lines, Anglophone versus Francophone, Lusophone versus Arabophone. But at Algeria, those divisions seemed to lose their meaning. Leaders realized that although their histories were different, their pain was shared. A sense of continental unity began to take root, fragile yet powerful. Still, the unity carried its own tension. Delegates acknowledged privately that pushing too hard might trigger economic retaliation, aid cuts, investment freezes, diplomatic pressure. The fear was real, but so was the determination. Silence has cost us more than speaking ever will, one East African minister said. The room murmured in agreement. This was the height of the summit's emotion, the moment Africa confronted resistance, not with hesitation, but with resolve. The declaration of colonialism as a crime was no longer symbolic. It was a warning shot aimed at a world order built on unequal foundations. Africa was not asking the world to remember the past. Africa was asking the world to answer for it. What unfolded in Algeria did far more than challenge former colonial powers. It forced Africa to confront its own present. Because when a continent decides to redefine its history, it inevitably begins to rewrite its political future. That is precisely what made the Algeria conference so consequential. It was not only a legal or diplomatic event, it was a civil and political awakening. One of the first civil consequences emerging from the discussions was a shift in how African societies understand their own suffering. For decades, poverty, instability, and underdevelopment were described as internal failures, corruption, mismanagement, lack of capacity. But the summit reframed these conditions as structural consequences of an engineered system. It allowed ordinary people to see themselves not as failed inheritors of a broken legacy, but as survivors of a system designed to limit their potential. That recognition alone reshaped the conversation across communities. The problem was not African inferiority, it was global inequity. Politically, the implications were even more profound. Declaring colonialism a crime means that modern African governments must now justify their policies not only to their citizens, but to history. Leaders can no longer hide behind inherited systems or claim helplessness in the face of global structures. The new logic is simple: if a system was imposed, then a new system can be built. That idea, quiet but revolutionary, places responsibility for the future back into African hands. It also raised the stakes for governments that have benefited from relationships with former colonial powers. Some African leaders privately fear that pushing for reparations could jeopardize aid packages or military partnerships they rely on. But others argue that dependence itself is a legacy of the very system Africa is trying to confront. As one West African delegate put it, "You cannot demand justice while clinging to the chains that bind you." This tension between historical correction and political pragmatism will shape Africa's internal politics for years to come. Another major civil consequence concerns cultural memory. The demand for the return of stolen artifacts struck an emotional chord across the continent. These are not merely objects of art, they are family histories, spiritual texts, royal legacies. For many African citizens, seeing their ancestors' sacred objects locked behind glass in European museums has always been a silent wound. The Algeria conference gave language to that pain, and when an entire generation grows up finally seeing its heritage at home, the psychological impact will be immense. Pride is not abstract. It is built from symbols, stories, and roots. Restoring those roots is an act of healing not only culturally, but politically. Economically, the consequences are no less dramatic. If reparations and structural adjustments were to move forward, African countries could renegotiate their place in the global economy. No longer would they accept mere participation, they would demand equity. By reframing colonial extraction as a crime, Africa is essentially arguing that the current trade patterns, raw materials, exported finished goods imported, are remnants of that crime. Calling these practices what they are forces a reconsideration of global supply chains and invites questions the world is not prepared to answer. Finally, the Algeria conference created a rare civil momentum unity. Civilians from different nations, ethnicities, and cultures saw their governments speaking with one voice. Social media across the continent filled with conversations, debates, and pride. For once, Africans were not reacting to the world, they were shaping the narrative. That civil confidence is politically transformative. It creates a public expectation that leaders must now meet. Because once people realize they can speak as a continent, it becomes much harder for politicians to govern as isolated states. In short, Algeria didn't just expose the past, it activated the present. It taught a continent that justice is not given. It is negotiated. And once a people begin to recognize their worth, the political landscape can never remain the same. From the outside looking in, the Algeria summit has placed the world, especially the United States and Europe, into an unexpectedly delicate position. For decades, Western nations have shaped global conversations about justice, human rights, and historical accountability. But when Africa applies the same principles back toward those very nations, the moral terrain becomes far more complicated. In Washington, policymakers who follow African affairs quietly recognize the significance of a unified African reparations movement. For the U.S., the implications stretch far beyond foreign policy or diplomatic relations. They extend directly into the country's own internal conversation about racial justice, because when African leaders declare colonialism and the slave trade as crimes that demand restitution, they echo demands made for generations by African Americans. The Algeria summit did not simply speak for the continent, it also amplified a struggle embedded deep within the American story. Some American observers, particularly scholars and civil rights advocates, see the Algerian Declaration as a moment of global moral clarity. They note that the United States has itself acknowledged historic wrongdoing, from the internment of Japanese Americans to the displacement of native communities, yet the legacy of slavery remains largely unaddressed through formal reparative mechanisms. Africa's move therefore raises an uncomfortable mirror. If reparations are justified abroad, what prevents their pursuit at home? Still others in the U.S. approach the movement with caution. They worry that supporting African reparations could set precedents that complicate America's geopolitical priorities or strain relations with European allies. The U.S. government has long balanced moral messaging with strategic alliances, and the Algeria Declaration touches the core of those alliances. After all, Britain, France, Belgium, Portugal, Germany, and Spain, America's closest partners, are the primary nations Africa intends to confront. Europe's reaction, though mostly unspoken, is even more complex. European leaders understand that acknowledgement without liability is manageable. Legal recognition with consequences is not. The fear in European capitals is not moral, it is structural. If colonialism becomes a legally defined crime, then the descendants of those who suffered have claimable rights, and former empires face measurable responsibility. Financially, culturally, and politically, the cost could be enormous. Quiet diplomatic circles in Brussels, Paris, and London already whisper about the domino effect that Algeria may trigger. Beyond the West, the rest of the world is watching Africa's move with a mixture of admiration and calculation. Nations in Asia, the Caribbean, and Latin America, many with their own histories of colonialism, recognize that Africa's bold stance could redefine global norms. India, Brazil, and several Caribbean nations have expressed moral alignment with the movement, sensing that a shift in international standards might allow them to revisit their own historical grievances. Meanwhile, global institutions such as the United Nations, the African Union, and international courts are being thrust into uncharted terrain. The modern international legal system was not built to prosecute centuries-old global structures like colonialism. Yet, if Africa presents a unified framework, the world may have no choice but to confront questions long buried beneath diplomacy. What does justice look like when entire continents were shaped by violence? How do modern nations reconcile the wealth of their ancestors with the suffering that produced it? In many ways, the Algeria summit represents a challenge not only to governments but to the world's conscience. It asks whether the West truly believes the principles it promotes. It asks whether the international order can evolve beyond the architecture built by former empires. And it asks whether global justice is something real or only something convenient. For the United States especially, the moment is historic. Africa is no longer a passive recipient of policy aid or advice. It is emerging as a moral force, one whose voice may soon reshape the very global norms the U.S. helped create. As the final session in Algiers drew to a close, something remarkable lingered in the air, something you could not capture in photographs or policy memos. It was the quiet understanding that a line had been crossed and there would be no going back. For the first time in generations, African nations spoke not as fractured states shaped by colonial borders, but as one continent demanding to be heard on its own terms. They were no longer asking the world to acknowledge their past. They were insisting that the world address it. Yet historic moments come with warnings, and the leaders at Algeria knew that powerful forces do not shift easily. Former colonial nations may respond with polite statements, reassurances of partnership, or gestures of deep regret. But beneath the diplomatic language lies a deeper resistance. Recognizing colonialism as a crime would mean recognizing responsibility, and responsibility comes with cost, economically, politically, emotionally. The world has built entire narratives around the idea that the past is settled, that yesterday's injustices are beyond the reach of today's laws. Africa just called that assumption into question. The danger now is not open confrontation, it is quiet erosion. Africa could be pressured into softening its demands. Individual nations could be persuaded to negotiate separately. International institutions could delay or dilute the process until momentum fades. History has shown that the greatest threat to justice is not loud opposition, but slow strategic exhaustion. That is the trap the Algeria Declaration must avoid. And yet, even with these risks, something irreversible has begun. By naming colonialism as a crime, Africa has reframed itself not as a victim pleading for recognition, but as a plaintiff entering the courtroom of world history with evidence, witnesses, and moral authority. This shift will reshape geopolitics far beyond Africa's borders. It will influence global conversations about slavery, reparations, resource ownership, and the meaning of justice in a world still struggling to reconcile its past with its present. The question now is whether Africa can maintain unity, courage, and strategic pressure long enough to transform this declaration into a turning point. Unity will be tested. Diplomacy will be strained. The world will watch closely to see whether Africa stands firm or whether this moment becomes another inspiring speech that fades into memory. But there is also hope, real, grounded hope. Across the continent and across the diaspora, millions are paying attention in a way they never have before. Young Africans, African Americans, Caribbeans, Afro-Latinos communities once separated by oceans and by centuries are beginning to speak the same language of accountability and restoration. And when a people recognize their worth, no summit, no institution, and no former empire can silence them again. So now, my friends, I turn the question over to you. Should Africa continue to push for formal reparations no matter how long the journey takes? Or is there another path to healing and restoration the world has not yet considered? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters more than ever. And if you believe, as I do, that truth must never bow to convenience, then share this message, support honest reporting, and stay with us as we follow this unfolding chapter of justice. In a world where leaders like Ibrahim Traoré in Burkina Faso are reshaping conversations about sovereignty and dignity, this is a moment the global community cannot ignore. For more Africa news and deep analysis, make sure you subscribe and stand with those who stand for truth.